the glory of being consumed by something that would outlast them all. The priests told them they were eternal in the Emperor's gaze, that though their flesh would rot, their service would never fade, that their names would be etched upon the stars. But in truth, the stars forget, the galaxy forgets. Only the silence remembers. Still, they believed, or pretended to, and in that belief, they found strength. Strength enough to march, to drill, to polish bayonets until their fingers bled. Strength enough to stare into the abyss of what was to come and whisper the Emperor's name without trembling. This was the glory that was, not light, but shadow, not joy, but ritual, not victory, but the promise of sacrifice. It was a fragile glory, built of paper flowers and borrowed hymns. And yet, in those early days, it was enough. Thus the soldiers marched into destiny. Thus they lifted banners that would soon be torn. Thus they sang hymns that would soon be drowned by screams. Thus they carved hope into rifles that would soon be broken. And thus, the glory that was ended, the drums ended, the banners tore, the hymns that once rose like fire were drowned in thunder that had no rhythm, only ruin. The war had come, and with it, all that was wholly unraveled. They were cast into the furnace without ceremony. The first world was nameless to them, though the officers barked its title with pride. A world of dust, blackened stone, and a sky that wept smoke. There were no fields, there were no rivers, only trenches, dug like wounds into the flesh of the earth. He entered the trench as a man. He left it as something else, or perhaps as nothing at all. The first bombardment fell before dawn. The sky cracked, the earth split, the heavens themselves vomited fire. Shells screamed as though the gods had been murdered, and their death cries rained from above. Men curled into the mud, pressing their faces against the soil as if to bury themselves before death could claim them. Others stared upward, eyes wide, mouths open, waiting for the impact that would erase them. When it came, it was not one sound but many, a cacophony of endings. Each blast a sermon, each crater a hymn, each scream a prayer. I remember him then. His hands shook, not from cowardice, but from being human. He clutched his rifle as if it were an anchor, though it dragged him down like stone. Mud clung to his face, streaking him in filth and blood, not his own. He did not pray, he did not speak. He listened to the silence that followed each explosion, the silence that was louder than the thunder, the silence that whispered, "You are nothing. You are already gone." The first charge was ordered when the sun was hidden behind smoke. The officers lifted their sabers. The sergeants lifted their whips. The priests lifted their censers. And the men lifted themselves from the trenches, climbing over the lip into the storm. There were no songs now, no hymns, only the sound of thousands of boots crushing mud, the clatter of rifles shaking in hands, the breath of the condemned rushing into the void. The enemy waited, unseen, unnamed. Only the fire betrayed them. Bolts of light, arcs of flame, rounds, tearing through flesh and steel alike. He ran. He did not think. He did not choose. He ran because the tide carried him. He ran because the machine demanded it. He ran because to stop was to die with a bullet in the back. Men fell around him. Faces vanished in red mist. Names erased before they were spoken. The man who carved wings into his rifle screamed once, and then was silent forever. Another clutched at his stomach, his entrails spilling into the mud, whispering words no one could hear. The banners rose and fell, riddled with holes, dragging through blood. And still they ran, still they fired, still they died. He reached the enemy lines, though he did not remember how. His bayonet thrust, his rifle cracked, his hands tore at shadows. There was no glory, there was only frenzy, a storm of flesh against flesh, metal against metal, hatred against fear. He stabbed, he struck, he was struck, He bled, he killed. He became death, not by choice, but by necessity. When it ended, there was no ending, only bodies, only smoke, only silence. The war did not stop, it did not pause, it did not allow mourning, for each day bled into the next, each night echoed with screams, each dawn was born in fire. The hymns were gone, the candles were gone, the paper flowers had burned away. What remained was survival, the gnawing hunger in the gut, the stench of rot in the trenches, the endless parade of faces that vanished into the mud, leaving nothing behind. Some broke. They sat in the muck, eyes vacant, mouths moving without sound. The officers called them cowards. The priests called them faithless. The commissars ended them with a single shot, their corpses thrown into the same pits as the enemy. But in truth, they were only men. Men who had stared too long into the abyss and found it staring back. He endured. But endurance is not triumph. It is simply another form of death. Each day stole a piece of him. Each night carved another wound upon his soul, until he was no longer certain if he lived, or if he too had already died and was marching still out of habit. The sky cracked again. The silence came again. The war unmade him not once, but endlessly. Each battle another unraveling, each scream another thread pulled from the fabric of his being. He was not man, nor angel, nor even soldier. He was echo. He was ash. He was silence, wearing flesh. This is the war that unmade them. Not a single battle, not a single defeat, but the slow erosion of what it meant to be human. The stripping away of memory, of faith, of hope, until only obedience remained. Asterisk, he knelt in the mud, not in prayer, not in surrender, but because his body no longer obeyed him. The weight of the rifle bent his spine, the weight of memory bent his soul. The field was silent, not because the war had ended, but because silence itself had claimed dominion. The cannons were hushed, the rifles stilled, the banners torn. Only the dead spoke now, whispering with mouths that no longer moved. The trench was filled with water. It rose past his knees, past his waist, carrying fragments of men within it, hands without arms, eyes without faces, helmets cracked and filled with nothing. He waded through this baptism of ruin, each step sinking him deeper into the grave that had no bottom. The officers were gone, the priests were gone, even the commissars had vanished into smoke. All that remained was him, and the others like him, shadows wrapped in rags. Soldiers without names, the condemned who still clung to rifles as if they were relics. In that moment, there was no order, no command, no emperor's voice, only choice, and choice was heavier than any chain. He came to the altar they had built in the ruins. It was no true altar, but a broken wall of stone, upon which someone had placed a skull. The skull's empty sockets stared at him as though demanding an answer. At its base, candles guttered, their flames struggling against the wind. The wax melted, pooling like blood. The scripture nailed to the stone was torn, unreadable dot. Here, men knelt before battle. Here, they swore oaths before they marched to die. Here, he now stood alone, awaiting a judgment that never came. He placed his rifle upon the altar. It was scarred, cracked, its barrel blackened from endless fire. The bayonet was dull, its edge bent. The stock still bore the faint carving of wings, though mud had filled their lines. He touched them once, remembering the man who had carved them, remembering that he was gone. He whispered words, though he did not know if they were prayer or curse. He whispered not to the emperor, but to the silence. For silence was the only God who answered. The sky tore again, a light brighter than fire, wider than horizon. It seared the world, a false dawn that revealed every scar, every wound, every corpse. The ground shook, splitting open, consuming trenches and men alike. The altar crumbled, the skull toppled, the candles drowned, and in that breaking, the voice came, not the emperor's, not the priests, not human. It was the voice of memory, the voice of the war itself. A whisper that filled him, though no one else could hear. You are nothing. You are everything. You are forgotten. You are eternal. He fell to his knees once more, this time not from weakness, but indecision, for he understood that judgment was not given, it was chosen. A man could not ask for forgiveness. A man could not beg for remembrance. He could only decide how to die. The next charge came. The officers did not lead it. The priests did not bless it. It was born only of desperation. The men rose from the trenches like phantoms, their eyes hollow, their mouths silent. No banners lifted, no hymns were sung. They carried only rifles, only bayonets, only the last fragments of will. He rose among them. The altar was gone, but its judgment was within him. He knew he would not return. He knew none would remember his name, but he marched regardless. The enemy fire came like rain. Men fell, torn apart, their cries cut short. Still they marched. The mud became a sea of blood. Still they marched. The sky cracked again, lightning of artillery shredding heaven itself. Still they marched. He marched not for victory, not for survival, but because the choice had already been made. The choice to be unmade completely, to pour his last breath into the abyss and leave nothing behind. He reached the line once more. The bayonet struck. The rifle fired. His voice, silent until now, broke into a cry that was not a prayer, not a curse, but something older. The cry of a man who has nothing left but the act of giving himself away. Steel clashed. Fire consumed. Blood washed the field. And in that storm, he was gone. No body was found. No relic was recovered. No name was inscribed upon the rolls of honor. Only mud, only ash, only silence. Yet in that silence, he remained, not as a man, not as a soldier, but as memory, as echo, as sacrifice itself, bound into the endless hymn of the guard. This was his judgment. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but to be forgotten. And in being forgotten, to belong to eternity. The field was empty, empty, not because the war had ceased, but because silence had claimed it. The guns fell quiet. The banners lay torn. The trenches filled with water and bones. Nothing moved but the wind, carrying the ash of 1,000 burnt lives. The soldier was gone, not buried, not honored, not named. Gone as dust is gone when carried by the storm, and yet he remained. A rifle was found months later. It lay half buried in mud, its barrel bent, its stock cracked. Upon its surface, faint carvings of wings lingered, though the grooves were filled with rot. The man who found it did not know its maker, did not know the hands that once gripped it in prayer and in fury. He lifted it, examined it, and discarded it among the wreckage. Still, the rifle remained, not as weapon, not as relic, but as witness, silent, unyielding, waiting for the day when even metal forgets its own shape. A helmet, dented and scorched, rolled into the trench water. It bore no crest, no mark, no name. Its inside still smelled of sweat and earth. Children, years later, played with it among ruins, not knowing whose head it once guarded, whose skull it once bore. They filled it with stones, with water, with dust. They laughed, and the helmet laughed with them, though its echo was hollow. The priests returned to the ruins. They declared the field sanctified, washed in blood that belonged to the emperor. They erected a shrine upon the altar's bones, a statue of faceless soldiers, their rifles lifted, their bodies kneeling, no names carved, no histories told, only the inscription. They were faithful, they were forgotten, they were his. Pilgrims came, they lit candles, prayed, touched the cold stone. None knew the man, none spoke his name, yet all felt his absence, as if absence itself had become holy. The years passed. The world turned. The war moved elsewhere, as it always does. The trenches collapsed, swallowed by mud. The ruins became overgrown with weeds that bore no color but gray. The shrine weathered, its edges broken, its inscriptions fading. And still, he remained, not in stone, not in scripture, but in silence. Sometimes, soldiers marching to new wars whispered of him, not his name, for they did not know it, not his deeds, for they could not recall them. They whispered only that one of them had gone before. One had knelt before an altar of skulls. One had chosen to die, though no one commanded it. One had become more than soldier becomes sacrifice itself. These whispers carried through regiments like wind, each time changing, each time erasing more, until nothing remained but the myth. And myth is stronger than memory. For memory dies with men, but myth lives forever in silence, on distant worlds. When the guard was mustered, some spoke of the nameless, the one who bore no name, yet belonged to all, the one who marched without banner, yet carried them all, the one who died without witness, yet was seen by eternity. His image was painted on the walls of barracks, a faceless figure, head bowed, rifle broken. Some prayed to him, though the priests scorned it as heresy. Yet the men prayed regardless. For a God who is silent may be holy, but a man who is silent is kin. The silence spread. Like a shadow beneath the hymns, it grew. It carried his echo into the marrow of the guard, into the breath of each drafted soul. He was not angel, not saint, not hero. He was only man. And because he was only man, he was eternal, and so he became myth. The myth not written in scripture, but carved in the hollows of the heart. The myth of every soldier who kneels in mud and knows he will not return. The myth of every drafted soul who walks into fire and becomes silence. The myth of sacrifice that asks for no witness, no honor, no remembrance. The war continues. It always continues. Worlds burn, banners fall, names vanish. Yet somewhere in the silence between shells, between screams, between prayers, there is still an echo dot, an echo of one man, drafted, unmade, forgotten, an echo that belongs not to him alone, but to all who are swallowed by war. And when the last candle gutters out, when the last hymn falls silent, when even the stars forget, the echo will remain, not as light, not as fire, but as silence itself. Asterisk, the war moved on. It always moves on. Like a tide without shore, it consumes one world, then another still. And the place where he fell was left behind. The field of ruin grew quiet. Cannons ceased. Trenches sank. The banners rotted in the rain. Only bones remained, bones mingled with mud, bones that no one claimed, bones that had no names. He was gone. Not buried, not remembered, not carved into marble. Gone as the breath of a dying man is gone, exhaled into silence. And yet he remained. A relic was found. A rifle, bent and broken, half buried in earth. Its stock bore shallow lines, carvings, almost lost to time. They looked like wings, though mud had filled them. A scavenger lifted it, turned it over, and tossed it aside. It was useless as weapon, useless as trophy, but the wings remained, carved by hands long dead. They whispered in silence still. A helmet drifted in the trench water. Its surface was cracked, its crest erased. No name was scratched within. It was lifted by children years later, played with as a toy. They filled it with stones, with water, with dust. They laughed, not knowing the skull it once guarded, not knowing the man who once breathed beneath its weight. And yet the helmet laughed with them, hollow and eternal. The priests returned. They built a shrine where the altar had fallen. Stone figures knelt, faceless rifles clutched to their chests. Upon the base they carved words. They were faithful. They were forgotten. They were his. Pilgrims came. They lit candles, pressed their lips to the stone, whispered prayers into the cold. None knew his name, none remembered his face, but all felt the absence, and absence itself became holy. Years passed. The world healed in ways only silence understands. Grass grew through trenches. Rivers filled the craters. The shrine weathered, its edges crumbled, inscriptions fading to dust, but the myth remained. Soldiers in new wars whispered of him. Not his name, he had none. Not his deeds, none could recount them. Only this, that one of them had gone before. One had marched without command. One had knelt before an altar of skulls. One had chosen to vanish so that others might endure. The whispers changed. With each retelling, more was lost. The man became shadow. The shadow became story. The story became myth. And myth is stronger than memory. For memory dies with the tongue, but myth lingers in silence. They painted his likeness in barracks, though no one knew his face. A figure faceless, helmet bowed, rifle shattered. The priests called it heresy, but the soldiers prayed regardless. For a god who is silent may be holy, but a man who is silent is kin on distant worlds. When the draft came again, mothers told their children, "Do not fear. There was one before you. He marched into fire. He fell into silence. He remains with you still." And the children nodded, and the myth deepened. In time, the myth had no beginning and no end. No altar, no rifle, no wings carved in wood, only the nameless, the faceless. The eternal silence between screams. He had become not a man, not a soldier, not even a saint. He had become the echo that lives in every drafted soul. The echo that whispers when the order comes, when the boots march, when the banners fall. This is the final truth. He was not forgiven. He was not remembered. He was not glorified. But he was not gone. For silence remembers what men forget, and silence is eternal. The war did not end. It never ends. The banners may fall. The shrines may crumble. The names may fade into ash. But the draft returns. Always the draft. Always the summoning of flesh to feed the furnace. The soldier who was unmade became echo. The echo became myth. And the myth sank into silence. Yet silence is not peace. Silence is only the night between bombardments. Silence is only the breath before the scream. The night came. It stretched across worlds like a veil, heavy and suffocating. The shrines grew cold, candles extinguished, prayers unsaid. The soil froze where bones still lay hidden. The rivers whispered with voices of the drowned in the sky. The sky was vast, unblinking, cruel. The stars looked down, but they did not remember. They burn, but they do not mourn. They shine, but they do not forgive. Still, men were gathered. Still, the drums of the draft beat upon every world. Still, the summons came nailed upon walls, sealed with the eagle's gaze. And still, the people obeyed. They obeyed though they knew. They obeyed though they had seen the shrines, the ruins, the bones. They obeyed though they whispered of the nameless who had gone before. For in the Imperium, obedience is stronger than memory. Obedience is the only survival. In the barracks of a new world, a boy lifted a broken rifle. It had no bullets, no bayonet. It was given to him only to teach his hands the weight of death. Upon its stock, he traced lines with a nail. Not wings, only scratches. Shallow, jagged, meaningless. Yet in time, another would see them and say, "These are marks of faith." Faith in what? No one would answer. The night deepened, and in the night came visions. Men dreamed of fields, not of grain, but of ash. They dreamed of faces without mouths, screaming silently. They dreamed of trenches filled not with water, but with stars, drowning them in light that burned their flesh. The priests declared these visions holy. The officers declared them cowardice. The commissars declared them treason. But the soldiers knew the dreams were memory. Not their memory, but the echo's memory. He was the last who remembered fire. the last to remember warmth before ash, the last to recall the sound of banners in the wind before silence claimed the stars. He did not speak. He did not need to, for the dead have no tongues, only echoes, and I am one such echo, carried like dust upon the breath of eternity. There was a time before the summons, before the draft, before the binding chains of oaths, a time when his hands were not stained by the weight of another's life, a time when the soil still bore crops and not corpses. But that time was brief, like a candle lit in the gale. It was extinguished without ceremony. It was forgotten, as all gentle things are forgotten in the age of war. The summons came not as a choice, but as a decree. No man chose war. War chose him. It entered the home as smoke enters, lungs unwanted, unseen, unstoppable. It was written on the decree nailed to the stone walls. It was sealed with the sigil of the double-headed eagle, its gaze unblinking, its wings heavy with judgment. The villagers knelt when they read it. Some wept, some cursed, some fell silent. All obeyed. For to resist was death, and to obey was also death. But one death was sanctioned, holy, sanctified by duty. The other was profane, forgotten, erased. He walked to the mustering fields. The ground was cracked, the dust rising in little storms around his boots. Others walked with him, young and old, strong and frail. None spoke, for words are weak things when fate has already spoken. At the field, they stripped them. Cloth was taken. Names were taken. The remnants of their lives were taken. They stood naked beneath the banners of the Imperium, naked before the eye of the God Emperor, naked before history. And when they were clothed again, they were no longer men. They were numbers. They were regiments. They were meat wrapped in khaki, destined for a furnace that had no end. I remember his eyes as he received his rifle. It was not awe, nor pride, nor terror. It was emptiness. A vessel ready to be filled with orders, and bullets, and prayers that would never be answered. The sergeants moved among them like carrion birds, marking the weak, marking the strong, shouting the hymns of obedience. They told the draftees that they were chosen, that their blood was holy fuel, that the Emperor himself watched. But the Emperor was silent, always silent. The only sound was the grinding of boots, the clatter of rusted weapons, the weeping of mothers beyond the fences. When night came, they slept on stone. They dreamt of home, though home had already become a memory. And in that dream, he saw his mother's face, though her features blurred like smoke. He reached for her, but his hands passed through ash, always ash. For, in the end, all faces in this galaxy are ashdot. The priests came at dawn. Their voices were shrill, their censers heavy with choking incense. They pressed purity seals upon bare skin, sealing flesh with wax and scripture. Some screamed as the hot wax burned them. Others endured in silence, learning early the virtue of pain. The priests declared them absolved of past sins, declared them empty, remade, sanctified by service. But in truth, they were condemned. Condemned to die nameless on a world not their own. Condemned to be forgotten even as they bled. He marched. He marched beneath banners he did not raise. He marched toward wars he did not choose. He marched because the drums commanded, because the orders demanded, because the Emperor required. Step after step after step, until his legs were no longer his own, until his will was no longer his own. The draft had claimed him, as it claimed all, and in that march, he was no longer a son, nor a brother, nor a lover. He was only one of the uncounted, the faceless tide, the countless hands that fed the machine of eternal war. The memory of home faded quickly. It always does. Faces dissolve, names blur, the scent of bread, the warmth of the hearth, the laughter of children all become shadows swallowed by the steel of the barracks and the thunder of the drill fields. Only the Emperor remained, always the Emperor. A name that was not warmth but fire, not comfort but command, not love but demand. He filled the void with prayer, but the prayer was not answered. It never is. It is not meant to be. It is meant only to bind, to remind, to control. They were taught to fire. They were taught to march. They were taught to kill. They were not taught to live, for life was no longer theirs. It belonged to the Imperium. It belonged to the Emperor. It belonged to the endless hunger of the front lines. Each man was stripped of hope, stripped of mercy, stripped of choice. They were made into weapons, and weapons are not meant to dream. And so, the draft ended. The man he once was ended. Only the soldier remained, a faceless soul among billions, consigned to a war without end. He was not alone, yet he was utterly alone. For brotherhood in the Guard is forged, not in joy, but in despair. A despair so vast it must be shared, or it will devour. Thus they clung to one another, nameless souls holding fragments of humanity in the dark, like sparks held against an endless storm. This is how the story begins. Not with glory, not with fire, not with victory. It begins with chains. It begins with silence. It begins with the draft, when a man is unmade and a soldier is born. Once there was glory, or so it was told. Glory not of men, but of banners. Not of blood, but of the colors painted on steel and silk. Glory of oaths sworn before altars, of hymns shouted into the sky. Of men who forgot their names so that one name alone would remain. They stood in ranks beneath cathedrals of iron. Their rifles gleamed with oil, their boots with polish, their eyes with the hollow shine of obedience. The priests called them chosen, the officers called them honored, and the sergeants called them nothing at all. For in the Guard, honor was not a gift, it was a burden carried on broken backs. I remember the banners most of all, red cloth gold, stitched with the eagle's gaze. They did not wave as banners should. They hung heavy, as though soaked in blood, long before the war began. Men saluted them, knelt before them, kissed their edges, but in truth, the banners were coffins, waiting to be filled with names. They marched in drills, unending. Step, breath, rifle lifted, rifle lowered. The sound of boots was not footsteps, but thunder, echoing in the vast stone fields. The sky itself seemed to tremble at their rhythm, and when they sang, their voices rose, not as men's voices, but as a single machine of sound. It was not song. It was not prayer. It was the echo of a people learning to forget themselves. The officers rode past on steeds of steel and smoke. Their voices rang sharp as blades. They spoke of duty. They spoke of destiny. They spoke of a throne upon which sat the Emperor, eternal and unseen. But none of the men had seen the throne. None had seen the Emperor. They believed because belief was demanded. Faith was the only rations that never ran dry. Still, in those days, there was pride. Strange pride. Pride not in self, but in sameness. In the way a man's face disappeared among 1,000 others. In the way his voice merged with a chorus. In the way his heartbeat was drowned in the drumbeat of the regiment. They were no longer men. They were legion. And to be legion was to feel eternal. Before the first battle, they were paraded through the streets of the hive. Civilians lined the avenues, their faces pale, their eyes wide, their hands lifted in uncertain blessing. Some cast flowers, though flowers had not grown there in centuries. The petals were paper, painted to look alive. Still, they fell like rain, soft and brittle, over the helmets of the marching men. Mothers clutched children to their breasts. Fathers lifted hands in the sign of the Aquila. Some wept, some smiled through tears, but most were silent, watching as their sons were swallowed by the tide, never to return. And the soldiers, though hollowed, stood taller. For in that moment, in the eyes of the people, they were angels, not yet ash, not yet corpses. but angels, clad in flacken iron. Even if the angels themselves did not believe it, they carried the weight of that illusion. In the evenings, they lit candles in the barracks. Wax melted on steel tables, dripping like blood upon scripture. They sang hymns, taught by the priests. The words were always the same, always of sacrifice, always of obedience, always of the emperor, silent and vast. But within the hymns, some found warmth. A warmth not from meaning, but from unity. To sing together was to feel less alone, and for a moment, that was enough. I remember one man, though I no longer recall his name. He carved tiny wings into the stock of his rifle, each line etched slowly, carefully, during the few hours when the drills ceased. When asked why, he only nodded toward the sky, as though wings carved into wood might one day carry him home. He did not return home. The rifle was found years later, buried in the mud, its wings filled with rot. This was his memorial. The drill masters taught them the catechism of fire. 1 shot, 1 breath, 1 kill. They spoke it until their throats bled. They carved it into their minds until their dreams were nothing but rifles, rising and falling. The rifle became an organ, the magazine its blood, the bayonet its teeth. Men forgot the warmth of hands, the softness of earth. They remembered only the chill of metal pressed against palm. And yet, there was still a strange beauty in the order. The rows of tents lined perfectly against the horizon, the voices chanting in unison beneath the banners, the gleam of helmets beneath the pale sun. It was the beauty of machinery, of inevitability, of something greater than the sum of its parts. This was their glory, not joy, not victory, not peace, but the glory of becoming part of the endless machine of war. Not their memory, but the echo's memory, the memory of the one who had gone before. The myth grew heavier. It clung to them as armor clings to bone. They whispered it before sleep, like prayer. They carved it into the walls of the barracks, into the dirt of the trenches, into the handles of their rifles. Not words, only shapes. A broken rifle, a bowed head, a faceless man. The priests tried to erase it. They burned the carvings, washed the walls, condemned the whispers. But whispers cannot be killed. They pass from mouth to mouth like breath. They live in silence. They survive in absence. The night stretched longer. Whole campaigns swallowed by it. Worlds drowned in its weight. It was not darkness of light, but darkness of meaning. The soldiers marched without banners, without hymns, without purpose. They became shadows in armor, ghosts who still breathed, dead men who had not yet fallen, and in every shadow was the echo, the faceless, the forgotten, the one who was gone and yet not gone. The silence became ritual. Before each charge, before each bombardment, before each final prayer, the soldiers would kneel, not at shrines, not before priests, not for the emperor. They knelt for silence itself, the silence between screams, the silence that held them when all else was torn away. It was blasphemy. It was heresy, but it was the only truth they had left. Some claimed they saw him, not in flesh, not in armor, but in the corner of the eye, a figure without face, kneeling, rifle broken across his lap. When they turned to look, nothing remained. Yet the vision lingered, carved into thought. Not saint, not angel, not ghost, only echo. And the echo walked with them into every battle. This was the long night, not peace, not victory, but silence stretched across centuries. A silence that carried no hope, yet carried them still. The war never ends. The draft never ends. The night never ends. And yet, within the night, within the silence, within the endless march, he remains. Not as name, not as memory, but as myth eternal, the faceless one who was unmade so that all might be bound in his silence. Asterisk, he knelt before the altar. It did not speak. He pressed his forehead to the stone. It did not warm. He tore his palm with the blade. The blood fell and vanished. No voice came, no vision, only silence. The priests told him he had sinned. The priests told him he lacked devotion. The priests told him the emperor hears all prayers. But the soldier knew the emperor hears only silence now. The cathedrals stood, but their doors were shut with rust. The incense burned, but it stank of rot. The hymns were sung, but their notes fell hollow. Faith had not died, it had starved. It had withered like a candle, forgotten in the wind. Once, they prayed before battle. Once, they kissed relics, bowed to saints, lifted banners. Once, they believed. Now, they marched without prayer. Now, they lifted rifles without blessing. Now, they went into fire with nothing but the weight of silence, and the silence did not break. The silence endured. The priests grew afraid. They saw their congregations kneel, not in chapels, but in trenches. They saw their soldiers bow heads, not to icons, but to the faceless myth. They tried to shout louder, to sing stronger, to bleed deeper, but the silence swallowed them. The commissars burned whispers. The priests drowned carvings. The officers hanged men who knelt in quiet. But the myth endured. The myth endured because it had no name. The myth endured because it was faceless. The myth endured because it could not be killed. The priest said, "Faith is the emperor." The soldiers said nothing. The silence said, "Faith is the faceless one," but no mouth spoke it. No hand wrote it. It lived only in silence. The wars grew longer. The shrines grew fewer. The relics shattered in hands that no longer believed. Once, a priest lifted a skull of a saint before the soldiers. They looked upon it with empty eyes. The skull fell. It broke. No one gasped. No one wept. The fragments sank into the mud, indistinguishable from bone already there. One soldier whispered, not to priest, not to emperor, but to silence, "If you do not speak, you are truth." And in that moment, faith broke. Not shattered with violence, not torn with heresy, but broken gently, like a thread stretched too far, too long, too thin. The chaplains bled themselves dry upon altars, but the stones did not drink. They tore their tongues in sermons, but the soldiers heard nothing. They burned incense, but it choked only themselves. They prayed to the throne, but it remained distant, gilded, lifeless. And in the trenches, silence reigned. The silence became holy. It was not declared holy. It was not blessed holy. But it became holy because it endured when all else failed. It became holy because it did not betray. It became holy because it did not demand. The silence was the only God that kept its promise, that it would always be there, and so faith cracked. It did not fall in one day. It did not vanish with one battle. It wore away, grain by grain, hymn by hymn, bone by bone, until only silence remained. Some priests tried to embrace it. They bent knee not to shrines, but to silence. They declared, "The emperor is the silence. The throne is the silence. The war is the silence." But the silence gave them no answer. And still, they knelt. And still, they wept. And still, they were forgotten. This was the broken faith, not rebellion, not heresy. Only the fading of light, until nothing remained but shadow. And in that shadow, the faceless one walked, not saint, not sinner, not hero, not God. Only echo, only myth, only silence. The priests still prayed. The commissars still executed. The banners still waved. But beneath it all, within it all, behind it, all silence, the silence that cannot be destroyed. The silence that walks with every drafted soul. This is how faith broke. This is how the shrines rotted. This is how the emperor's voice was drowned by silence, not with rebellion, not with blasphemy, but with the simple truth. He did not answer, and silence did. Closing lines of Act V. The shrines cracked, the relics rusted, the hymns fell still, and in the hollow where faith once dwelt, silence took its throne. Asterisk, they did not march for banners. They did not march for hymns. They did not march for priests. They marched because their feet remembered. The ground pulled them forward. The mud knew their weight. The ash swallowed their steps, and still they walked. The sky was blackened. The cities were hollow. The oceans boiled. The stars burned cold. And still they walked. The officers shouted. The commissars killed. The priests begged. The saints were silent. And still they walked. No one looked at the soldier beside him. No one spoke. No one wept. No one laughed. They only walked. Shoulder to shoulder, rifle to rifle, grave to grave. This was not glory. This was not faith. This was not victory. This was only the march. They marched through ruins where banners once flew. They marched through cathedrals where prayers once rose. They marched through trenches where brothers once sang. Now the banners rotted. Now the cathedrals cracked. Now the trenches filled with water and nameless bones. And still they walked. One by one they fell. The first to hunger, the second to flame, the third to blade, the fourth to silence. But the line did not break. The march did not falter. The dead fell into mud. The living stepped over them. And still they walked. The march was the only creed left. Not emperor, not saint, not relic, not prayer. Only the rhythm of boots. Only the pounding of hearts. Only the silence between. It was said that in those days, soldiers did not carry names. They did not carry banners. They did not carry hope. They carried only the march, and the march carried them. 1,000 worlds burned. 1,000 shrines fell. 1,000 prayers were unanswered. But 1,000 boots still struck the earth. The march did not end. There was no destination. There was no victory. There was no salvation. The march was the destination. The march was the victory. The march was the salvation. The commissars called it discipline. The priests called it devotion. The generals called it obedience. But the soldiers knew it was none of these. It was silence. It was inevitability. It was the final truth that, even in death, they would walk. Some said the march was heard in the void between stars. Some said the march shook the throne itself. Some said the march echoed in the ears of gods long dead. But the marchers did not know. They did not hear. They did not care. They only walked, and in the march, there was a kind of peace. No orders, no prayers, no doubt, no faith. Only step after step, into eternity. At last they marched beyond the horizon. The dust rose, the ash followed, the silence deepened, and no one saw them again. But the march did not end. It never ended. It cannot end. For those who are drafted, there is no homecoming. For those who are drafted, there is no grave. For those who are drafted, there is only the march. The faceless one was among them, not leading, not following, simply walking, as he always had, as he always will. And still, they walked. Closing lines of Act 7, they marched into dust. They marched into shadow. They marched into silence, and the silence marched with them. The march ended where all marches end, not in triumph, not in homecoming, not in light. It ended in the tomb. The tomb was not built. It was not carved by hand. It was not sanctified by priests. The tomb was the earth itself, the dust, the ash, the silence. The tomb was every battlefield where no banner rose again. The tomb was every trench where bones drowned in rain. The tomb was every cathedral where prayers died in smoke. The tomb was every nameless grave dug by no hand. The tomb was the galaxy itself. There were no inscriptions. There were no epitaphs. There were no words. Only silence sealed the stone. Only silence carried the weight. The faceless soldier lay among countless others, not crowned, not sanctified, not adorned. He lay as he lived, nameless, voiceless, forgotten, but in his forgetting, he became all. For when one is nameless, one belongs to all names. When one is faceless, one wears all faces. When one is forgotten, one endures in every silence. They lowered no coffins. They lit no fires. They sang no hymns. There was no mourning, for there were none left to mourn. There was no weeping, for the tears had dried with the oceans. The galaxy itself wept dust. The stars wept silence. The tomb was sealed not with stone, but with forgetting. And yet, not all was lost. For the tomb of forgetting is also the womb of myth. Fragments remained. A rusted bayonet buried beneath the roots of a forest that should never have grown. A torn banner carried by winds across dead plains until it turned to threads. A prayer coin pressed into the hand of a child who could not name its giver. Each relic without meaning. Each relic without history. Each relic without name. And yet each relic burned with the weight of all who marched. The priests would one day claim the relics. They would carve stories around them. They would bind them with names never spoken. They would call them sacred. They would call them holy. But they would be wrong. The relics were not holy. They were empty. Empty, and therefore eternal. For only emptiness endures. The tomb grew heavier with each war, each draft, each march, each silence. The galaxy itself was becoming a sepulchre. The stars themselves dimmed beneath the weight of memory unspoken. And yet still, myths rose. Whispers of soldiers who do not die. Whispers of faceless hosts who march forever. Whispers of forgotten warriors who kneel in ruined cathedrals long after the guns are silent. The whispers were not true, but they were not false. For myth is neither truth nor lie. Myth is memory unmoored. Myth is the echo that survives the tomb. Faceless soldier became myth. The draft itself became myth. The march became myth. And myth cannot be entombed. It walks where silence walks. It lingers where names fade. It endures when all else rots. Thus, the forgotten were sealed in silence, not remembered, not forgiven, not glorified, but eternal nonetheless. For eternity is not light. Eternity is shadow. Eternity is silence. Eternity is the tomb. So ends their march. So ends their war. So ends their memory. Not with fire, not with hymns, but with dust, with ash, with silence. The tomb was closed. The banners rotted. The relics crumbled. The stars turned their faces away. And then came silence. It was not silence of peace. It was not silence of rest. It was not silence of healing. It was the silence that follows slaughter. It was the silence that feeds upon memory. It was the silence that endures when even gods are ash. The eternal silence, it spoke louder than any hymn. It weighed heavier than any oath. It endured longer than any empire. The silence became their grave. The silence became their hymn. The silence became their monument. For monuments fall, cathedrals crumble, scriptures fade, stone splits, metal rusts, but silence endures. Silence cannot be shattered. Silence cannot be slain. Silence cannot be burned. Silence is eternal, and in that silence walked the faceless host, not in flesh, not in bone, not in steel, but in absence, the absence of voice, the absence of name, the absence of glory, the absence of return. They were gone, and yet their silence filled the galaxy. The commissars did not speak of them. The priests did not sing of them. The generals did not inscribe them. And yet, when the wind moved across the ruins, the silence spoke. When the void deepened between the stars, the silence remembered. When the dead worlds burned without witnesses, the silence endured. This was their eternity. Not songs, not statues, not scriptures, but silence. Some whispered the silence was the Emperor's judgment. Some whispered it was his forgiveness. Some whispered it was his death. But the silence itself whispered nothing. Silence does not bless. Silence does not curse. Silence does not explain. It only endures. And so the drafted became silence. Their march became silence. Their deaths became silence. Their eternity became silence. Worlds turned. Empires rose. Empires fell. Faiths shifted. Gods warred. Gods died. But silence remained. It does not change. It does not tire. It does not end. The faceless one, too, dissolved into silence, not remembered, not erased, simply gone, and in being gone, more present than any living saint. For saints are prayed to, then forgotten. But silence is never forgotten. The silence became their shrine. Every battlefield, a cathedral without walls. Every grave a prayer without words. Every absence a monument, and still, silence grows. For every draft, for every march, for every nameless dead, the silence swells, it deepens, it spreads across stars, until the galaxy itself is but a tomb of silence. This is the fate of the drafted, not songs, not glory, not remembrance, only silence, forever. Asterisk, the silence endured. It covered stars. It swallowed worlds. It drowned prayers. It became all dot, and yet, within silence, there was ash. Ash that whispered. Ash that glowed. Ash is not fire. Ash is not life. Ash is not triumph. Ash is ruin. Ash is aftermath. Ash is what remains when all else is consumed, and yet, ash carries memory. Ash carries warmth. Ash carries echo. Ash carries the shape of what once was. In the ash, their march still lingered. In the ash, their breath still clung. In the ash, their faith still smoldered. The drafted had become silence, but silence was not perfect. Within its depths, ash stirred, faint, hidden, but not gone. The ash glowed in strange places. In a ruined cathedral, where candles had not burned. For 1,000 years, a faint warmth lingered on the altar stone. In a crater where bones lay beneath rainwater, a pale shimmer rose when the wind touched the pool. In the darkness of the void between systems, a dying star cast embers that looked like a standard still aflame. Ash, not fire, not life, not return, but still. Ash. Children once picked up the ash of a ruined shrine and pressed it to their foreheads. They did not know the names of the dead. They did not know the war. They did not know the march. But they felt the ember, and they bowed their heads. Priests gathered the ash in urns, though they could not say why. Generals avoided the ash, though they feared its weight. And wanderers walked into ruins heavy with ash, and swore they heard footsteps in the dust. The drafted were not there, and yet, in the ash, they were. Ash remembers what silence forgets. Ash remembers the weight of banners. Ash remembers the roar of prayers. Ash remembers the tears in the dust. Ash remembers the names, though it does not speak them. It glowed faintly, in the cracks of memory. Never enough to guide, never enough to heal, but enough to endure. The galaxy is ash now, every world, every tomb, every ruin, and in every ash, there is a faint ember that still glows. The drafted will not rise. The drafted will not return. The drafted will not be forgiven, but they are not gone. They are ash, and the ash still glows. Thus ends the chronicle. Not in triumph, not in peace, not in salvation, but in ember, in ruin, in the glow of what cannot be extinguished.